Good evening, everyone. Please can I welcome everyone to this meeting of the Scrutiny Committee on Wednesday, the 23rd of November. We are in the Walton Suite in Winchester Guildhall. The time is 6:32 p.m. My name is Councillor Brooke, Chairperson of the committee, and before we start I have a few housekeeping points. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded to the Council's YouTube channel. Subtitles are available and advice on how to turn this on is set out on our website. If you're joining us online, please turn your camera and microphone off until your item and you're asked to speak. And please can everyone make sure their mobile phones are on silent or switched off. Lastly, can I remind members to use their microphones and speak directly into them. Please do not turn away when speaking to enable your comments to be picked up on the recording of the meeting. In the unlikely event it's necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound, and please follow instructions given to you by your team and assemble in Abbey Gardens. Can I welcome our lovely TAC team that we have with us this evening, and no, not that one. Thank you for coming, and I'll invite you forward if you'd like to speak later on. I was about to say and welcome Councillor Wallace, but now you've just walked in, so I can say it now. And thank you for coming. I'll invite you forward if you have any comments you'd like to make later on during the meeting at your item, if that's okay, but thank you for joining us this evening. So turning to the agenda, I understand Councillor Laming's been replaced by Councillor Rutter this evening. Are there any other updates, Matthew?
Good evening, Chair members. Just apologies from Councillor Krask.
Many thanks, and thank you, Councillor Rutter, for standing in. Do we have any declarations of interest this evening? No. In announcements, I just wanted to refer to, there was quite a long discussion about risk at the performance panel, and of course we mentioned risk last time on our scrutiny meeting. So we discussed that Councillor Horrell, Councillor Cutler and I would have a meeting with officers. We have had that meeting and it will go back to the performance panel for further discussion, but currently responsibility for the oversight of corporate risks and horizon scanning for emerging risks sits with the ELB team. ELB regularly review and update the risk register, particularly when things are unpredictable and in flux or major decisions are being taken. The Audit and Governance Committee receive regular governance monitoring reports and a copy of the latest corporate risk register. It's within A&G's remit to request in-depth reviews and risks should the committee have concerns. If concerns are identified during detailed scrutiny work undertaken by the scrutiny panel or performance committee or performance panel, these will be raised with the A&G for additional work to be commissioned, and that will be discussed, as I say, by the performance panel. Overall, it was felt that the risk management framework in the risk policy was adequate, but that raising the profile of risk management across all three committees was definitely a worthwhile thing to do. So I just wanted to give you an update that we had followed up on that, as we said we would. Turning to item 4 on the agenda. Minutes of the meeting held on the 7th September 2022 and 29th September 2022. We have 2 sets of minutes to approve. Has everybody had the opportunity to see that, and do we all agree? Wonderful. So coming to public participation. I believe, TAC team, you don't wish to specifically say anything at the moment, but if anything comes up later in the morning, in the meeting, you may wish to. Wonderful. Okay. In that case, can we, Councillor Wallace, is there anything you'd like to speak on now, or would you prefer to speak when we get to item 8 on the agenda? Okay, no problem at all. So turning to item 6 on our agenda, HRA business plan and budget options. So starting at page 21 of the agenda pack, the recommendation is that the committee comment on the proposals within the attached cabinet report, Ref Cab 3365. We are noting that we are being presented with this detailed HRA report, and it will come to us on the 7th February 2023. So this evening it's just for noting, and if there's any initial questions you have on it. We have our lovely officers here this evening. Gillian Knight and Richard Botham, should we have any specific questions? And we also have, sorry. And I was about to say that. And we also have Councillor Ferguson here as well to support us. So on to that, do we have any questions on the main body of the report, please? Councillor Ferguson, would you like to do an introduction?
Yes, please, if I may, Chair. Thank you.
Apologies, I'm slightly distracted. My document won't load, so I'm all thrown off kilter.
It's okay, thank you. I just really wanted to highlight a few things to Scrutiny Committee today. Obviously, when this paper was written, one of the factors that we look at in the paper is the potential for a rent ceiling, a ceiling on the rent increase for social rents this year. At the time of writing, the government was consulting on potential for caps of 3%, 5% and 7%. In the report, there is detailed analysis of what a 5% ceiling might mean to the HRA budget. That at the time was what the market expected the government to come down at to actually impose a 5% rent increase ceiling. In the statement on Thursday last week, the government in fact set a 7% rent ceiling. In the paper, we do provide analysis of 3%, 5% and 7%, but the detailed work has been done on 5%. Now we have that clarity around the 7%, there'll be more detailed work done on that 7%, what that means and what the options are for a cap, a rent increase below that as well. There are important things to note. The paper shows that if there had been a 5% rent ceiling imposed, that actually the HRA budget over a 30-year period in this options paper was still viable and sustainable. If the cap, the ceiling had been put on at 3%, then the HRA draft budget options would not have been sustainable and there would have been hard decisions to be made. The paper also points to some really significant factors affecting the 30-year plan this time. The significant inflationary effect and pressures affecting cost increases both in how we maintain our properties and all our charges, general costs, but also for our new build programme. And also that upward trend in public work loan board interest rates having an impact on borrowing, what we'd need to borrow over 30 years to maintain that new build programme. The key thing to say also is that in the paper, we have been consulting very closely with TACT through this process, both with the government consulting, and we will continue to do so now we have clarity. And the only last thing I wanted to add is, even before the government was seeking to consult on whether there would be a rent ceiling this year, for next year, we were already concerned about the impact of cost of living rises on our tenants. So we were already beginning to look at what that rent increase might need to be, given that they particularly are under so many pressures. And in fact, at the Cost of Living Summit yesterday, to which Councillor Horrell was also in attendance with myself and also the leader, one of the factors was shown that those who are suffering most from the cost of living crisis are actually those who are in social rented accommodation, generally because the cost of living crisis is having such a disproportionate effect on them. So we have certainty, but at the moment the paper was written when we didn't have that certainty. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. So, going to the committee, do we have any questions on any items up to item 14 on page 33? Councillor Ferguson.
Oh, I do apologise. There is one more point of clarity as well. You'll note that on the report, there was one clarification and one amendment. I also wanted to clarify section 7.4, where it refers to, 7.4 is on, thank you, thank you very much, where it refers to all new homes are built to high energy passive plus standards. That is not actually quite correct. What it should in fact say is that the council is committed to building high energy efficiency homes, and a policy was accepted. The housing development strategy, which was adopted in 2021, makes it clear on page 8 that the council is committed that all new council homes will be to high energy efficiency standards as possible. We did approve a passive house plus scheme for Southbrook cottages at Cabinet Housing on the 31st of October, but that was very much to see how that works, to monitor and review it. So then that section 7.4 does need to be corrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to draw people's attention to page 27, and it's for workforce implications 4.1, and the quote is, some of the options for consideration for next year's budget may require additional staffing resource. I just want to know at this stage, are we referring to having agency staff, or would we be looking at actually employing staff in the council? Would it be full-time, part-time? Have you given any thoughts to that at this stage? I realise it's for next year's budgets, but I just want to get an understanding of how we will source the staff. Thank you.
Mrs. Knight.
Thank you. No, we're not considering agency staff. We are looking at new responsibilities that will be coming our way under the building safety legislation and regime.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
And the other area that we may need to look at is under the Retrofit Ready programme. We've had such a substantial and positive response to the letter that's gone out to our tenants. In fact, we sent out 1,600 letters to our tenants who are in the most badly performing properties. As of yesterday, we'd had 662 people respond. So it may be that there would be additional staffing needed there, but that's something for us to look at when we've actually looked at all those responses. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Cook, can I ask you to turn off your microphone, please? Councillor Krask. Apologies, I can't see the thing. My mind's gone blank. Moisen, sorry.
No worries, Chair. I've been called all sorts of things in my time. On page 32, I'm not getting ahead of ourselves, am I? Are we okay to cover 32? Thank you. So there's a point in there around the impact of the phosphates issue, which we all know is delaying planning permissions for all sorts of developments, not just our own. So what I'd be interested to know is what is the impact of this on our long-term ambition to build 1,000 new council homes over the 10-year period? Or in other words, how long is it before it becomes unlikely we cannot catch up? And then the secondary question to that is, what agencies have the power to resolve the matter? And have we got any ability to put pressure on them beyond what we're already doing?
Mr. Botham or Councillor Ferguson, did you want to respond first?
I'll let Mr. Botham respond and then I may add something.
Chair, this is an area obviously that we're working on very closely at the moment and looking how this impacts on schemes. We have a scheme on site at the moment that has a potential implication there. So very current. We see it, as a relatively short-term issue. So it's an issue that has to be addressed. If it isn't addressed, development across the country or across the area can't move forward. We have had meetings with our planners and legal team recently to look at whether there's any interim policies that will help us at least keep developments moving forward, subject to granting conditions or whatever. So there's a lot of work going on there at the moment. Certainly government pressure about a national solution, and it's Natural England that we're working with around what the ultimate assessment will be. But so can't really give anything more clear than that at this stage, but very much an issue of focus at the moment.
And I'm sure Mr. Botham knows this, but Push are leading on trying to resolve this problem. And we are looking to find a solution. At the moment, it is holding up a couple of small schemes. For example, the Dyson Drive scheme is being held up. But there are a couple of others which are being held up. But as Mr. Botham says, unless it's resolved, it won't just be us. It will be everybody.
Councillor Todd?
Yes, at the last Partnership South Hampshire meeting, this was a big discussion that we had with Natural England, Southern Water, and the person who Environment Agency and actually the major stakeholder that wasn't in the room that does need their arm twisted, which is Ofwat, because they're responsible for the water company's investment programme and the rules that allow them to invest. And there is a lot of interest in Southern councils in collaborating on this. There are also discussions about the options of what we can do with our own wastewater treatment plants, which could potentially give us credits, at least on phosphates, I think, that might enable us to get some resolution to the issue. So it is something we're taking very seriously, and we're working very closely with particularly Fareham, Eastleigh ourselves, and I think Test Valley were most interested in how we can collaborate in order to resolve this.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, thank you. And it's a question perhaps not just for answering this evening. This paper came to Cabinet a few days ago, and I did raise then that it was unfortunate that the discussion we're having tonight, cross-party and reviewing the document, had not been done before. And I think it's just a request to officers as they plan the 23-24 calendar that this type of document gets that review before it goes to Cabinet. I think it would be better for all of us and hopefully contribute to a better outcome for the HRA. So I think that's a question perhaps for officers to see if they could resolve going forward. Chair, one of the things I think just overall on this paper, clearly on the day it was welcome that we had a draft because we were not privy at that stage to the rent direction. Now that we have that, obviously, we can do some updating. But what this draft paper did show is that 5% is sustainable for the HRA. So the question to the officer team is, given that we now know the ceiling can be 7, are you minded to make any substantial changes to this paper that we don't have before us this evening? Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Horrell, for the question. I think it's only prudent for us to, now we have the ceiling at 7, to actually look at modelling at the impact possibly at 6%. But of course, if we do that, we need to then talk about how that affects the HRA and what that might allow us to do going forward. Because even though it's sustainable at 5, it does have a longer term impact on both borrowing and how much rent is returned and how many new homes we can build going forward. But even though we might model, it is very much in consultation the next stage till we actually get to the rent setting. Before we didn't know what we were doing, so we just did 3, 5 and 7. So we will model 5, 6 and 7. And of course we will consult with tax. That's really important that we do that. Also, if I could clarify, I know at Cabinet, Councillor Horrell, you asked the question about shared ownership. The rent ceiling that's been imposed, it's been set by central government at 7%, doesn't actually apply to the shared ownership scheme. Again, we're going to be looking very closely at what we do with that. That's only a small number of properties. However, a significant increase if it was CPI plus 1%. The industry at the moment is minded, and there's a voluntary code generally in the industry where they're looking to set it at 7% for shared ownership. So we'll be looking at that too and the impact of that. So just in case that was your follow-up question, I thought I'd address it now.
Many thanks. So there was also a question about perhaps bringing this in advance of cabinet, if that's a possibility for consideration.
Thank you, Chairman. We're currently establishing the committee calendar for next year, and we certainly want to get the spine of our meetings together. That's well under preparation. We'll be sharing that with members shortly. I think we need to consider whether there's a different meeting this could be considered at, or whether a special meeting could be considered, or whether it's a members briefing. So we'll take that away and note that, Chair. Thanks.
Many thanks. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, the supplementary on the original question I asked is that if those additional modelling opportunities are to take place, I think we discussed at Cabinet, correct me if I'm wrong, that was consideration for this to go back to a Cabinet Housing Committee for a broader discussion. I'm just welcome the opportunity to understand when those other alternatives will be presented so that members can have a full discussion on them. Thank you.
Perhaps if I assist, I can see that work is still ongoing. I believe that will require discussion between the lead officer and the cabinet member as to how they wish to take that piece of engagement forward with the wider membership.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions up until page 37, before 37? Councillor Westwood.
Thank you, Chair. If I can return to paragraph 7.2, retrofitting. Given the rising costs highlighted in the report and indeed the success of people coming back to us with an interest in retrofitting, is there a need to allocate more funds in the budget for the retrofit programme?
Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Westwood, for the question. I think the one thing that we have to note in the budget is that 15.7 million that we've allocated over 10 years is still very much there and in that budget. Our commitment to retrofitting our social housing stock is still very firm, despite budgetary pressures that are coming at the HRA as they are in the general fund. Obviously, cost increases may mean that the cost of retrofit is also higher. So there may be we can do less with that funding. That said, we have now actually put in our bid for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is central government funding. That bid went in on Thursday. Our bid is a total of just over £1 million. That is match funded, so the government will only actually give us half of that. However, we are bidding for additional funds where they are. And if we win that bid, it will allow us to pay for loft installation for 350 properties and for a significant retrofit for our 19 Swedish cottages, including external wall installation, doors, windows, loft, basically the full works. It will also allow us to pay for air source heat pumps for some of those properties too. And importantly, for the monitoring equipment, which will allow us to evaluate the impact of that deep retrofit. So yes, costs going up does affect the programme. The benefit is we're still protecting that 15.7 million, and we are looking for additional external funds wherever we can find them. And my fingers are crossed that we will be successful, given the amount of work that we should be proud of the retrofit team that they've put into that bid. Thank you.
Councillor Horrell.
Chair, we discussed at Cabinet, and I don't see at this stage that we have altered the figures. I think Mr. Botham said he would address it, but there seems to be an inconsistency in some of the general numbers used in the general fund financial forecasts and indeed the HRA, And indeed, we're in the HRA forecasting inflation at a different rate from which the Bank of England is recommending. Just wanted to understand what the game plan is with the financials overall to get some reconciliation of that. Thank you.
Yeah, clearly there was time to make some sort of minor amendments to the paper, but that would have resulted in changing some of the figures in the paper, which would take a little bit more time. We did give a commitment in Cabinet, though, that we would review all of the assumptions in the General Fund paper and the HRA paper and ensure that they were consistent by the time we bring the detailed reports in February.
Thank you.
Councillor Rutter.
Thank you, Chair. If I could just briefly go back to the retrofitting issue. Isn't it the case that a 6% rise may enable us to do more of the retrofitting that our tenants are clearly very keen to have? And of course, retrofitting all this new insulation and stuff does actually reduce their costs in terms of heating costs. So whilst they, it swings and roundabouts, whilst they might pay a bit more rent, they save a lot on their electricity and gas bills. So I think it's definitely in our interest to weigh that consideration in the balance of when we're discussing the level that we do eventually go to.
Did you want to comment, Councillor Ferguson?
Thank you, Councillor Rutter. I think there was a question in there, and I think it is very much that, that conversation with tenants when we've done that modelling to give them, that option of if it were 6, not 5, what could that mean for you? Because you're absolutely right. If we can increase the energy efficiency of their homes, make them less leaky, then their bills are going to go down. And obviously at the moment, their energy bills are so high as a proportion of their overall income that could have a more significant effect than actually that slight change in rent. But we all have to be cognizant of the fact that it is a cost of living crisis and our tenants are being almost the most adversely affected, particularly if they're disabled tenants. I think those were 2 key factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ferguson. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rutter. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, one of the key elements, and we discussed it, Cabinet, I think, is the number of houses we aspire to build, which we all, I think, are wholeheartedly supportive of, but how much money we have available and the costs of doing that. In fact, we, I think, rightly approved the building of 6 homes in my own ward that are going to cost us more than they're currently valued at, and that's an equation we cannot continue to sustain, although obviously the tenants will have much reduced running costs as a consequence. My understanding is that we were being offered by the administration an opportunity to talk about standards and how we aspire to those, and obviously the local plan is very much trying to include some very robust policies that allow us to ensure we build homes to the right standards for the future. But it is obviously a fundamental question in balancing the HRA budget. And I just wanted to ask, when are we going to have that conversation, which is clearly important, in the context of the other piece of work, which is the local plan, which will set the framework for planning permissions for ourselves and developers relative to this particular budget development for the HRA. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
I made a commitment at Cabinet that I was happy for us to see how we could have that conversation, but very much with tenants involved too. There is actually a tenants carbon focus group, which is at the moment being drawn back together, and we're asking for volunteers. So there are discussions going on with tenants around this. I think as an administration, we are totally committed to the climate emergency. We're very clear that we want to build homes to the highest energy efficiency standards, the lowest carbon standards. But I think it's legitimate that a debate is held, and it may be an item that we can add to the Cabinet Housing agenda, where we have that cross-party discussion, but we also have TACT at the table, which is a very important voice as well. The only other thing I would say is the sheer response we've had from our tenants around would they like to be part of that retrofit ready programme clearly shows how much they value the idea of living in more energy efficient, fuel efficient, lower bills, homes with lower bills at this time. So it isn't just being driven by the administration, the desire to live in high quality energy efficient homes, which are good for them and also good for the planet and cost them less, is very important to them. But I am happy for us to, I will talk to Mrs. Knight and we will look at how we can bring that to Cabinet Housing, where we have both voices from both sides of the table, plus tact with us at the table as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. Do we have any more questions before we move on to the second half of the paper? So item 14 until the end of the main body of the paper. Does anybody have any questions? Page 37 to 47 of our main body of the report. Councillor Horrell?
Chair, the one question that I think I'm not sure we've addressed, and maybe it's something for Mr. Botham, and that is that we do have significant reserves in the HRA, and obviously we're in a very difficult time at this stage, but we're all looking to a brighter future. And therefore, what should be our strategy? What is the right approach to the use of our reserves potentially to help us through this bumpy period and maintain the HRA activity at the level that we all aspire to? Thank you.
Mr. Botham?
Chair, we have Dick Johnson online, who may be able to add any further clarity if my answer is insufficient to respond to Councillor Horrell in full. But broadly, we've got significant reserves in the HRA as of today, but it is a 30-year plan, and we do manage it over a 30-year period, and those reserves are fully committed throughout that business plan. And if we used more than is projected in the plan as it stands here now, in the early years, that means you couldn't fund some of those programmes in the later years of the plan. Now, members could take a decision to have an unfunded long-term plan and have additional resources in the shorter term. That isn't something that we're recommending in this paper. We've got a sustainable long-term plan that can be financed as shown in the paper, and committing more than is projected in this paper of our reserves would compromise that long-term plan. So that's the choice that members would have in considering those issues.
Could I ask just a supplementary on that though? But if there is a desire for a greater level of energy efficiency, better quality, the aspirations given the climate agenda, to do more of that more quickly, is it wrong to potentially consider bringing some of that forward to allow us to do that more in the short term? And I think another member asked, should we be adding more to that fund, and look to building back some of that in the latter part of the HRA plan? Thank you.
Chair, obviously there's a balance between short-term and long-term planning. The issue we have with the HRA is that you won't be able to build it back in the longer term, because rents are set and the business plan is based on rent, assumptions that rent increase by inflation or near to inflation. It's very unlikely that nationally rules will change that would allow significantly above inflation increases in the social housing sector. That could happen, but that hasn't happened for a long time. If anything, we see downward pressures as we're seeing now, like the cap well below inflation, quite rightly so. So if you're to change the plans to put a greater focus on retrofitting, which it will have, that clearly has its merits, it would be at the expense of wider programmes such as the New Homes programme. It's a balance between the two.
Thank you, most helpful. Thank you.
Did you want us to throw to Mr. Johnson, or did that answer the questions? Okay. Apologies, Mr. Johnson, I didn't say that you were online. Should we have any questions? So apologies for that. Do we have any further questions on the second half of this paper to the end of the main body of the report? No. We'll come on to Appendix 1. Oh, Councillor Hall.
I suppose, Chair, just almost a comment, and that is that, you know, we still have a significant number of people in our district who need homes, and that we, with all the pressures of everything else we've talked about, and we've spent a lot of time tonight talking about, you know, the rent levels, retrofitting, all those others, but at the end of the day, there's a very basic requirement still for hundreds of people to still have a home in our district, and for us just to bear that in mind, that we have a, you know, an outstanding HRA, one we should all be proud of in the district, and that we have to keep that in mind, that we have to still keep providing homes, decent homes, I accept, but homes nonetheless that many aspire to because they just don't have today, Chair. So I suppose I'm just looking for confirmation that we still aspire to keep building at a rate that we know that we have to maintain. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
The paper identifies that over the 30-year term, we would in fact add an additional 1,700 on the current build rate to our existing stock. And that obviously allows for the attrition that we have through the right to buy, where we lose some housing. So we are continuing to build. But it is very much the case, you know, when we look at those, the rent increase, we have to look at the longer term. It isn't just the people on the housing list today. It is the people on the housing list in the future that we have to consider. And in fact, you know, I don't want to speak for Mr. Light or Mr. Chafe, but they often bring that up. We also have to look to today, but we also have to look to the future for future generations of people in our district who will need social housing. And as we all know, we live in perhaps one of the most unaffordable districts where private rented accommodation is very high indeed. Thank you.
TAC team at the back, just as you've just been referenced, we've just coming to the end of the main body of the report. Do you have any comments you'd like to make at this stage, or Mr. Chair?
Yes, I agree that we do have to look to the future and future people who would need affordable housing, and that 6% would enable you to do more. And I know some on TAC might be in favour of that, but we'd have to have discussion about it for what the majority would want and give our views then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lyons. So that sounds like definitely something worth bringing to the Cabinet Housing and having that roundtable discussion. That would work for you all. Do we have any further questions on this last section of the report before we come to the appendix? No? Appendix 1 then. Do we have any questions on Appendix 1? No? Appendix 2? Do we have any debate on this item? Councillor Cutler.
Yes, I'd just like to comment about the difficulty of a 30-year plan with very turbulent times at the moment. And I think we're right to be cautious, but there are aspects, and I think what this has drawn out is that we do need a debate about how important it is to what standards we build to, what standards we retrofit to at this time, despite the costs. And part of it is the sort of increase in inflation is terribly frightening at the moment, and the increase in interest rates is quite a shock to the system. But what is quite different compared with, say, in the 80s with high inflation is, in fact, the interest rates are below the inflation rate, which actually means the borrowing is it's always cheap money in comparison with. So although it looks as if the the interest rates have made it so much more expensive to borrow money. If inflation's always higher than the interest rates, in fact, it's relatively cheap money, as it has been over the last 10, 15 years, where inflation's run at about 2% and interest rates have been below that. I happen to look back at the position I was in the early 80s, where inflation was running at about 10 and interest rates were around about 15. That difference was quite extreme, whereas we're now talking about interest PW, Public Works Loan Board figures of 4%, and we're still talking about inflation at 10. So that actually makes some of the planning over the longer term more difficult. To say it's unsustainable if we spend earlier won't necessarily be the case. So it's going to be quite an interesting judgment call to talk about what we need to do now. And I think one of those key things about the standards that we build to is that we really do have to a certain extent, be the exemplars in the district of what can be done, even if it is expensive. And I do think that there's an element of being quite bold about that and bold about the retrofitting as well. So they're my comments on the paper as it stands and where we might go.
Thank you, Councillor Cutler. Do we have any further debate on this item? Councillor Horrell.
Chair, thank you, and a thank you to the officers and the portfolio holder for presenting the draft paper in circumstances where we were at the time uncertain about how we could progress on some key elements. I think it's been helpful in our learning and our understanding. Overall, I'd like to say that I think this plan, because it is sustainable at 5%, gave us some level of reassurance that we could continue to deliver all the good works that we know the HRA can and hopefully will continue to do in respect of homes in our district, given, as already stated this evening, we know that we're exceedingly expensive. So the work that we do in this particular area is crucial. I think it will be helpful for all of us, and I think we've identified tonight several areas of debate in the Scrutiny Committee that we all need to get our heads around. What is the balance here? And also in terms of building, retrofitting, levels of increases, and importantly, how our tenants feel about those levers. And to get a very accurate understanding of their desires. We're under more pressure through legislation to get a better feel for tenants and make sure that we work closely with them. And this is a good example where we will be able to do that, Chair. And I hope that we will grasp that with both hands and proceed. I think hopefully it's reassuring to the TACT team here tonight that we care a lot about all of this and actually want to deliver the very best for our current tenants and our new tenants, and that you can be reassured that we'll give it our best efforts to deliver a good outcome for everyone with the support of the officer team. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Horrell. Any other debate? Councillor Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. I find every time I come to a committee, a new committee, sort of every day's a school day. I learn something new about the way things are that I didn't know before, and the point that Mr. Botham made about the limitations going forward. And what I mean by that is, in a time when you've got massive turbulence and particularly high inflation, what you'd ideally like to do is to dampen it down by not doing all the change you need to in this and next year, but to sort of take a long-term view and say, okay, we'll do some of it in the following years. But it sounds like the council doesn't have the power to do that because it's constrained by national rules, guidance, whatever. So that's my lesson for today. The lesson I've learned today is it limits our ability to, and the power we have to do perhaps what you might ideally want to do. So I think it does make that challenge of finding the sweet spot of trying to dampen down the short-term pain without actually creating a lot of long-term pain through not being able to build houses. It makes that challenge quite difficult. So I'm going to say good luck to to the portfolio holder and the Cabinet Housing team in trying to find that balance. And I suspect it's somewhere in that range of 5 to 6%. And it's just, you know, taking on board the input from TACT and others to try and find that sweet spot of how to play it.
Thank you, Councillor Crimoyson. Any more for any more? No? Okay, well, thank you for your engaged discussion on that one. The points I've noted are can the documents such as the HRA budget paper go to scrutiny or cross-party discussion in advance, and that's going to be taken away for consideration. We'll be awaiting feedback on how best to communicate the outcome of the modelling of percentage increases, and there was the thought to bring the retrofit discussion to Cabinet Housing meeting for cross-party discussion with TACT at the table as well. So any other items that I've missed in my points? No. Okay, so thank you for that. The recommendation was for us to note that paper, so we've done that and we can pass our feedback on. Coming on to item 7 on the agenda, the general fund budget. So it was the report CAB 3374 which was presented to Cabinet. Thank you, TACT team. We shall see you again soon, no doubt. Which was presented to Cabinet's meeting on the 15th of November and sets out the options for the 23-24 budget, including anticipated changes and budget proposals. So it starts at page 53 of the agenda pack. Our recommendation this evening is that we comment on the proposals within the attached Cabinet report, which can be considered by Cabinet prior to its meeting in February 23. Just to note that we will be presented an updated version of this general fund budget report at our meeting on the 7th of February in 2023 prior to full council. We have in the room Councillor Power and Mrs. Keys to help us out should we have any questions. Would you like to give an introduction, Councillor Power?
I would, Chairman. Thank you very much. Modelling the inflationary pressures has been a challenge. And of course, there is a lack of degree of certainty about how those will fold out in the future. We have taken the median view. But the events of the last few years have demonstrated that could be easily overset. Working out where we can increase income and reduce costs has been the subject of a great deal of work with both officers and Cabinet members to work through. Reflecting on those meetings, the common threads have been looking at the impact on residents, ensuring that the marginalised are not further marginalised, and I think we all see examples of that as we go about our ward work, and looking after the staff who have looked after us for the last few years. Heads of service were constructive. They quickly took on board the problem and the magnitude of the problem we are looking at, and they also made constructive suggestions as to how we could change how we operate in the future. There are large savings to be made. This paper brings together what we are doing to address those challenges, and I look forward to your comments, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Power. Okay, so coming to the paper, the Cabinet paper that's before us, do we have any questions up to item 16 on page 65 of our agenda packs, please? So the first portion, Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. On page 57, it's section B, that in relation to staffing matters. Could you sort of give me a little bit more information on this additional vacancy management provision of £200,000 be included? Then I see a further 130 regeneration programme, and that's to support fund staffing to support the move into delivery phase. And then following on from that, section D, an additional 80,000 per annum be included to address the impact of the on-street parking agency, which ends, I know, in 2023. And then there's another one underneath, which is an additional 50,000 per annum be included to fund additional street scene works. So I need to get my head around those. Can you help me with that, please? Thank you.
I'll do my best, Chairman. The street scene work is to make our high streets look more attractive. This was work that was done by the County Council, a lot of it, until a few years ago. I'm thinking of the weed cleaning and the gutter cleaning, but they've had to make their own economies. But it came through in Councillor Thompson's discussions with the market towns that we need to spruce things up a bit. That's an additional budget to achieve that. The transfer of the on-street parking agency, that is the need to pay staff over to the County Council. And Mr. Botham has more detail on that, which we've been asking for in a minute. The strategic development advice, this is to do with the major decisions we're going to have to be bringing forward on regeneration. This is skills that we do not need forever, but we will need in the short term if those projects are to be brought to delivery. The 250k, I think you asked about that, the review of salaries. We are out of...
No, I didn't ask.
I beg your pardon.
No, we didn't ask that one. I asked about the £200,000 be included, the vacancy management provision. Thank you.
Mr. Botham will take that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We're obviously looking at our budget performance over recent years. Every year we fortuitously achieve a lower than budgeted spend on staffing just through natural changes and gaps between people starting posts and notice periods, that sort of thing. What we've done this year is to set a firm target of maintain that at around 4%. So it's not significant gaps in staff or anything like that. It's just we're going to watch that budget much more closely, make sure that that we're accounting for that now rather than getting to the outturn stage. Which is, are we underspent? So we're making decisions on the basis that we will routinely achieve some variance on the salaries budget. We're just going to keep a closer eye on that and make sure we keep to a 4% target. But that will result in about 200,000 savings that prevent us having to make that 200,000 somewhere else. I think that's the key to it.
Thank you. Councillor Cook.
There was also something else, Chair, that Councillor Power said that you were going to answer.
I don't think so, Chairman. But
was it not the 80k? You were referring to Hampshire, and I just wanted to understand
this is
that more.
the transfer of the on-street
Yes.
parking services.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Botham may have further detail.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, as things stand, the team are doing work on the impact of passing back that the agency to Hampshire County Council. We obviously want to retain a quality off-street parking service. We currently get a better economies of scale from running the two together. This is the net impact of losing half of that, some of that work. So if we're going to maintain our standards in our off street, it will have an impact on the staffing team. So that's the reason for that.
Thank you. Councillor Cromwell.
Thank you, Chair. If I could have a little poke at item 9 in the recommendations, which refers to, I think, item 16.3 further on page 65, if I've got it right. You haven't. Where are we?
Yes, that's right, Councillor Cromwell.
Thank you. The reference to using 450k from the transitional reserve, I mean, serious strategic review has been talked about and it's a sensible thing to do. I'm just wondering, what will that money be spent on, and what kind of ballpark range of outcomes do we anticipate could come out of that review. And I appreciate some of that could be highly sensitive, so you may need to be very careful what you say in the public domain. So just wondering, give us some idea of what the outcomes might be from that amount of spend.
Councillor Power.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Councillor. If you'd like to look at section 18.3, I think that gives you a clue as to which areas we are digging into. How we operate the park and ride services, that's an easy one. It is, we want to move the traffic out of the city centre. What do we do to make that happen? Tourism, how do we best support tourism? Are there opportunities for savings there as we look forward? So that the reviews look at, again, the impact on the economy, the impact on our residents, what difference does it make, but look properly at how much savings we could make by changing how we deliver that service. Streamlining of planning services, there are other authorities that manage to do this more cheaply. We need to look at how they do that. What is the impact on residents in terms of the quality of decisions made and the impact on applicants? We have a fairly stringent local plan. We want to make sure it's implemented properly. Public conveniences, how do we look after them better? Are there opportunities to save money in how we maintain them? Is it an investment programme? Are there sources of investment so that we could make those changes? Off-street parking, are there ways we could make that more cost effective? The CCTV contract is up for renewal. Again, it's what changes could we make? Do we have to do monitoring? Is that a service we could sell to other councils? I know my town council is interested in a CCTV service. Could we contract out that service and achieve economies of scale by doing so? And I suspect the other market towns are having those sorts of problems as well. How we look after our highways. Now, I might get my figures wrong here. We provide a service to Hampshire County Council which pays for 4 cuts a year in certain areas. We actually do 6 cuts. Is that an indulgence or is it necessary for the safety of residents? We always look at the grants programme. It's a perennial favourite. But again, we have to look at the value of those grants and the difference it makes to residents. We are looking at the management of corporate assets. We do this every year. I think it's a perpetual favourite. We're in a very different market now and it does need to be assessed properly. And how we use the Guildhall and Abbey House. What a capacity is there for increasing revenue and saving costs? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And if I could just have a supplementary, that's really full and comprehensive response in terms of the areas to be looked at. I guess I kind of think I know the answer because, been in the game myself, but I guess we're spending the money on people who are experts in this space, consultants who have got the experience and have done this stuff elsewhere. So they're bringing in their experience of what works, what doesn't work, and rather than us just deciding on some of these things, they're able to say, give some certainty that if you do X, Y, and Z, it will actually pay off and give you some real value. I'm not sure I put a question in there, but there's an implied question.
Thank you, Chairman. We are not the only council with these problems. And there are people out there that have provided a similar investigation service for other councillors and produced sensible conclusions. And that is the sort of resource we would like to use.
Councillor Todd.
Yeah, and as it says, it's invest to save. I think there may be cases where if we spend some money on, I don't know, better IT infrastructure, we'll find that we're able to get more problems handled more effectively through the back end of what we might be doing. If we spend in certain ways on Abbey House, for example, it becomes possible to rent it out. So it isn't, it is, as it says, it's invest to save. In a lot of these areas, our current CCTV system is absolute rubbish. It's past the end of its life. And so if we invest in capital, it becomes something that can handle more capacity and potentially becomes something that can be rented out. So I think it's quite important that we look at, when we say invest to save, we mean it. And we're looking where there may be opportunities and why we've established this budget for some smart spending that enables us to achieve longer term revenue savings. And that's why we've framed it in those terms.
Mr. Botham, did you want to say something?
Just to add, I think one of the questions Councillor Cromwell asked was around some of the end goal here, and the paper details the shortfalls that we're facing within 2 years. So we have 2 years to do some pretty significant changes, transformation to the way we operate, and we're looking broadly at a 3 million deficit there. So that's the challenge really that this is seeking to achieve. The only other comment I wanted to make is it isn't just about spending on consultants either. Some of this work will be done in-house, some will be done by officers, some will be backfilling officers to free the capacity. The challenge we've got is the capacity teams have to do this work as well as their day job is really challenging. So it's really identifying the best way to invest that money to complete the review, to make sure that we can work towards that end goal of addressing those deficits that are detailed in the report.
Thank you, Mr. Botham. Councillor Cook.
I think I'm going to make a statement, but I think it will end up being a question. Okay, we keep talking about consultants, and there are people out there that actually do short-term contracts. So are we as a council actually looking, here comes the question now, the first bit was the statement. So are we actually looking at short-term contracts where we can actually, these people have the expertise to be able to do what we're referring, but not go down the go to a consultant, which I believe, if you don't mind me saying this, will actually cost us more money. Because most consultants, they are expensive. That's what I'd like to say at this point. Thank you.
Mr. Botham.
Yeah, it's really just to elaborate a bit on the previous point that I made, and that's exactly one of the examples that we're already looking at. So, for example, we have an area, a service which requires a bit more intensive management at the moment, and we know of someone who can do a good job supporting the team in doing that, and we've recruited them on a fixed-term basis. So we're already looking at options like that. We want to get best value out of the whole process, but so yeah, taking that on, it's about identifying the best way to complete the process. But I don't know if members wanted to add anything.
I would like to add a word on consultants. There are cases where we use consultants because that indemnifies the council. And I think that's an important factor to remember when we look at the consultancy budget. Thank you.
Councillor Todd, you look very keen to speak.
Yeah, no, I think it's also important to realise that we have quite a wide definition of consultant when we put things in the budget. An archaeologist is a consultant when they appear in the budget. An architect to design a new council house is a consultant when they appear in the budget. So it's quite broadly defined. So when we're talking about bringing in, we're often talking about bringing in very professionally defined experts in a very particular area to help us solve a particular problem because they are expert in it. So, an archaeologist, when we contract archaeologists to do archaeological work and give us advice on archaeological programs, that's a consultant. We're not talking about sort of, people in sharp suits from London coming to, that's not the space we're in. We're normally focused on real experts, particular areas where we will benefit from people who really know their stuff.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, on page 63, we have a whole section on council tax. Given the additional information we had last week in the financial statements from the government, what are we minded to do now regarding council tax for the 23-24 period?
Councillor Power.
Thank you. That is being worked on. We don't know. I don't see any reason at the moment to change from the 2.5. But we are in dynamic times.
Councillor Todd?
Yeah, as you know, the rules for district councils are 2% or £5. And if you look at how most districts have done it in Hampshire, we normally look at the £5 because it's a bit more than 2%. In practice, the 3% is pence in terms of difference that we're talking about in a yearly basis. It's not a very large difference for us because the £5 is already more than 2%. Where it makes a huge difference is at the county council, where the difference between 2% and 3% and 5%, which they are able to do because of the support for adult social care, is in the tens of pounds, or the hundreds of pounds, not the £5, which is the space that we're playing in. So the difference is pretty marginal. I think our council tax is what, 150, 160 pounds a year, something like that, and 3% is £4.80. It's £5. That's the sort of space we're playing in. The government announcement didn't have a noticeable effect on our choices as a district.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Councillor Horrell, you had a follow up to that one.
Well, I think Councillor Powers said that you were looking at the numbers, and Councillor Todd's indicated that your view is that it's marginal, whatever those changes might be, but marginal may also be important at this time. So just seeking clarification, but thank you for the answers.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions on that first section of the paper? Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Todd made a really strong comment there earlier about our CCTV is rubbish. So I just wondered, you referred to that, and it's quite a strong thing to say, because if our CCTV is rubbish and we are paying someone to do that work, number one, why is it still rubbish? If you feel that strongly about it, what's being done about it? And thirdly, when is the contract due to be? You mentioned it's due for renewal. When is it due for that? Do we own it? Do we have? Is it contracted? Because if it's rubbish, this is the word you used, why are we not doing something about it?
So the answer is we are doing something about it. It's rubbish in the sense that it's now old technology, and so the kind of things that you want to be able to do, like remote cameras, using the internet, supervise them in a central place. I mean, we've moved away from the days when it was, cathode ray tubes connected to coax at the top of the top of Friarsgate. Happy times for those of you who ever went to have a look at it. To it is now a bit more digital. But there was a real frustration when we were having antisocial behaviour problems, that the kind of thing that we will be able to do if we get a next generation CCTV system, like put in temporary remote cameras and other such things, is not currently possible, and that is the kind of thing that we need to be looking at. So it's the world has moved on. It was a good system when it went in, and the world has moved on. We need more capacity. We need to be able to put in more cameras. New things happen where we're going, we would love to be able to put a camera here and monitor it. And the problem we have is that the technology is now holding us back. So we have a paper coming forward about a refresh of both the technology and the supervision contract to make sure that it meets our needs, not just as a city, but as a district, and has, as has been talked about, the opportunity to be offered to partners as well.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Any other questions on that first section of the paper? Okay. Sorry, Councillor Horrell.
Chair, we talked in the last paper about ensuring we had tenants' input, and helpfully there's been a resident survey 2022. We have a couple of headline numbers, but we haven't seen that as a council, and clearly it's being used to direct some of the decision making based on the feedback that has been received. Is that document to be shared with all councillors, please?
Mrs. Taylor?
Thank you, Chair. I can take that one. Yes, we have been using the data from the resident survey and indeed the new census information to create both the budget and our new annual refresh of our council plan. And in fact, some data was shared with parishes last week in the development of this report and was shared with staff today. And the information is being put on the DSU this week for all members to see. Thank you.
Chair, if I could just say for that information that went to parishes that we hadn't seen, it would have been helpful if councillors had received that before our parishes. Again, were asking us questions on data that we weren't aware of. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Horrell. Okay, so we'll move on to page 65 up until page 72 then, that section there. Do we have any, up to item 24, do we have any questions on that section? I wanted to just ask on the garden waste piece, we had a 10% increase with immediate effect that was approved at Cabinet, but that 20% would be needed to fully recover all operating costs, but noted that the concessionary discount had a 50% increase. But it also doesn't reference how much of that 10% that we haven't put on the general charge is funded by that 50% increase on concessionary rates. And I wondered if we could have some clarification on that.
The increase in concessionary, it's an increase in the discount that we're giving on concessionary rates. So in other words, so at the moment, there's a £10 discount. So if you sign up for a £39 a year service, the 140 litre bin, you pay £29 a year. But we're increasing it to £43, but we're increasing the discount to £15. So actually, for those people, it will go down by £1 to £28 a year. And for people who are buying the £59 bin, it will go up by £1 to, it goes up to 65, so it goes to £60. So we picked 15 because it was simple and seemed fair in terms of its impact.
Thank you for that clarification. That's not how I'd read it, so I appreciate that. Any other questions on this section up to page 72? No, and the rest of the report to the end before we come on to the appendices. Any further questions there? No? Okay, do we have any questions on Appendix 1? Appendix 2? And the final part of the appendices? Councillor Cutler.
Could I ask a more broad question, which probably covers those appendices, is whether there is any indication yet as to... Every year we talk about a potential 3-year settlement, and it hasn't happened. Did we get any indication in the autumn statement, and are we likely to see an announcement in time to refresh this paper after Christmas?
Mrs. Keys?
Thank you, Chair. No, there wasn't any indication in the recent and we wait with bated breath for settlement hours just before Christmas, then rapidly digest in order.
Do you have any hope that there will be a longer term settlement in that, given the chaos in the Department of Levelling Up and the change of ministers continually? I just wondered if there's any possibility that they've done the work.
We haven't had any indication that there will be a settlement. Had no indication either way, but I remain hopeful.
Councillor Todd, you'd had your hand up. Did you still want to speak at that point?
Yes, I've had a very useful email from the District Councils network at the LGA, breaking down a full report of the Secretary of State's comments at a recent meeting of the Levelling Up and Housing Committee at the Houses of Parliament. And that suggests that they are looking at council finance in quite some detail. They are actually looking at a replacement for council tax. But we are not going to get any kind of clarity on that anytime soon. So the two statements that might be useful is certainly there's a commitment that there will not be a business rates reset or reform of the system until after the next general election. He is considering how district councils can be properly resourced through the finance settlement. He acknowledged that the autumn statement provided more support for social care authorities, but not particularly for us. There is work to be done to, quote, simplify local government finance, reducing funding streams and granting a greater degree of local discretion, although no concrete timeline or detail was provided. So I'm very happy to circulate this email to all members so that we can all have an understanding of what we're hearing from the Local Government Association on local government finance. But in essence, there is nothing coming. There's nothing specific coming in any time soon. What they did talk about, which, as I said, is that the local government minister, Lee Rowley, is working with the Treasury to consider council tax reform at the request of the Secretary of State and the Chancellor. Quote, this was in early stages and could be discussed with the committee in the new year. So it does sound like a longer term finance settlement, and a 2-year settlement is not currently on the table.
Councillor Cutler, you had a supplementary to that.
It's not so much a question, it's more a comment. Our expectation over the last few years on a longer term settlement has always included a rebasing of the business rates. I note in here that you've actually already taken into account they're not going to do that. So I think the likelihood of getting any sort of long term settlement more than just a tweak this year is I mean, it does clarify it for me now. I hadn't picked up the fact that there's been this commitment not to change the business rates until after the next election. Yes, that's quite good for us, isn't it? To know that, at least.
Thank you, Councillor Cutler. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, I have a couple of questions on page 78 and 79. The first one, it was an interesting comment from Mr. Fox on a briefing today on the local plan about the fact that we need to generate energy where we need it. And I'm intrigued by the possible solar farm feasibility project. Where and what is that on page 78? And then also the indication on 24-28 on page 79 that the possibility of selling assets in the current review of assets by the council, and indeed the thought that where they're proving expensive to renovate or funding of those are difficult, that they may be considered for sale. My question is, where are they? And also, once that is sold, of course, the money is gone. So the strategy for reinvestment of that. Clarity on both of those points would be appreciated. Thank you, Chair.
On the subject of asset sales, I mean, just doing a proper due diligence on the assets that we have means that we would look at certain properties that we own and consider whether we might be able to make more progress with them if somebody else owns them, or there are other reasons where we ourselves on our own are not able to sort out a particular site. I mean, a good example of a useful asset sale is where, for example, we're selling the Upper Brook Street car park in order for it to become a GP surgery. Although I think we're maintaining a ground lease, but you know, there's a surprising number of bits of Winchester where we have a ground lease and somebody else has built a building on top of it and made more use of it than we would do. So I don't think that's a particular problem. Similarly, you know, when we look at our decarbonisation plan, it's requirement of us to, in order to get to net zero as a council, we do need to look at generation, and we would not be doing a proper job of looking at the options if we only looked at which buildings we could put solar panels on. We do need to do a proper, we are looking at, you know, are there options for a solar farm, but it's one of those things where as soon as you get into it, there are an endless number of complexities that need to be considered, such as the type of location, the impact on people in the area, the size of it, the connectivity, is there electricity supply nearby? There's a whole bunch of things that need to be thought through. So there will be, before we make any decisions, there will be a proper due diligence process to understand where we are and what the options might be.
So Chair, is the leader prepared to say where that solar farm is?
As I said, we are still trying to understand the different options and what it involves in order to create a solar farm and in order to achieve our net zero ambitions. And so I don't think it's appropriate to start talking about different bits of land that we might hold anywhere in the district, because frankly, we need to do a proper evaluation job, and we need to make sure that we have the plan for it to succeed as, when and if we come forward with something.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions on this paper at all? If not, we shall move on to debate. Do we have any debate on this paper? Councillor Rutter.
I'd just like to say I think that the officers and the cabinet member have done a remarkable job given the very difficult circumstances in which this paper has been put together. So I'd just like to commend the work that they've done and thank them very much.
Thank you, Councillor Rutter. Any further debate? No. In that case, we have looked at the recommendation that we comment on the proposals attached. I didn't have any specific recommendations to pass back to Cabinet or to the officers, unless anybody can highlight to me anything they think I missed. No? Okay. So thank you for your engagement on that one. We shall move on to item 8. Councillor Wallace, I believe you wanted to speak on this item. Would you like to come forwards now?
Thank you, Chair. Right, a couple of bits on this. First, I know I've brought this up before, but I'm still struggling to understand the answer. Why is there such a delay in reviewing the performance data? We're now in November, end of November, and we're reviewing performance data from Q2. I've worked in lots of businesses, and whenever the further you get away from when the data was generated, the harder it is to actually influence things that are happening. So in a lot of the business I worked in, which were big businesses, we would have the Q2 results would be out 2 weeks after the end of Q2. And here we are looking at them 5 months later. It's Q2. Ah, well, I would apologise then. I will apologise then. I'm sorry about that. Okay, right. I'll skip over that and my little monologue, so sorry about that.
Are you all right with that now, Councillor?
Oh, well, that 2 months is fine. I was going to say 2 months is okay. Oh, thank you. Right. Okay, sorry for wasting everybody's time. Right, I have a whole bunch of questions on the quarterly QPIs, the annual KPIs, and some of the projects. And I know I've talked to Councillor Thompson,
Councillor Horrell.
Councillor Horrell, sorry, before about taking these to the performance panel. Unfortunately, I didn't get them to you in time this month, so I'm just hoping it's probably not appropriate for me to go through all 14 just now. I think I've got 14 or 15 questions. I'm just hoping I can send those to you after the meeting and perhaps we could get those addressed.
Yes, I think that's fine, Councillor Horrell.
Chair, yes, Councillor Wallace and I did have a discussion that he wanted to ask questions. I said we would be very happy as a panel to feed those in. There may be some consistency with questions already being asked by others, but we could manage that. The process, I think, is already in train for the review of the questions that were asked last time. If there's anything we can help with that isn't covered, then we can address that. And certainly, I think going forward, if we can help by making sure that we get your questions into the system at the very beginning of the process, then obviously we can do that. And of course, to reassure you, Councillor Wallace, you can hear today, because Scrutiny is the overarching committee for the panel. We do the grunt work in advance, as it were, so these meetings are not too long. But in fact, you are, as a councillor, entitled tonight to ask any of those questions of the Scrutiny Committee. So whichever best meets your needs, we can address that with pleasure.
Well, I've got 3 or 4 bigger ones that I could probably bring tonight, and then I'll perhaps send the other ones to you if that's okay. So first one was on the quarterly.
One moment, Councillor Wallace.
Sorry.
I'm just going to pause you there. I think it might be worth coming to Councillor Horrell's feedback on the report before we ask you questions, in case any of them are answered in the feedback. So we'll do this a slightly other way round. Councillor Horrell, may we have your feedback first?
So, Chair, we did our usual review, our literal page turn as a panel for you. The objective, obviously, is to do that detailed work for this committee. As usual, members of the panel were asked to give questions in advance, and then additional questions were asked at the meeting. As you know, we review the council plan, major projects, and the specific KPIs that have been allocated for various aspects of the council performance. I think it's fair to say that we're all waiting for the council plan refresh and the commensurate review of KPIs, because I think we feel that many of the KPIs are quite difficult because they come significantly later in the process. Sometimes they're from other bodies, and that some of them have been not necessarily helpful in our monitoring of performance. Officers then follow up on any questions that couldn't be answered in the committee meeting. And before you tonight, you have the document that summarises our questions from that session and the answers given by officers. And indeed, there were a couple of questions that were following up from our August assessment. As you know, we have officers with us in the meeting, and officers come online to try and address questions specifically on the day. And we're grateful to the officer team for guiding us through all of this, because it's quite detailed work at the time. The big issue that came out of the last meeting was the one that the chair addressed in her opening remarks this evening, which was the further consideration of risk, given the volatility of the current economic situation. And we've had a very constructive discussion with Mrs. Keys on that. And obviously the report that was given this evening reassures us that we've got various actions and policies in place to ensure that we cover those risk assessments well, along with the work that clearly the senior leadership team, officer team, conduct. We as I say, are waiting for the KPI review as part of the local plan, council plan refresh, because that is still something that I think we feel misses some of the requirements that we all would have as a panel and scrutiny committee. So, Chair, I think the document on page 167 summarises our detailed review, and if there's anything there that I can help Councillor Wallace with in terms of additional comment, very happy to do so, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Horrell, for that good introduction and summary. Have you read, Councillor Wallace, the item starting at page 167, the summary?
I have read most of this 200-page document, yes. So, but these questions, so these questions are in addition to what the questions that were asked, I believe.
by all means continue then with your 4 biggies, and perhaps we'll look at the smaller questions then separately.
Yeah, take those ones offline. First one was on the quarterly KPIs, TCE02, which is the reduced levels of waste and recycling. I was surprised that this one was marked green. The recycling metric dropped in Q2 and is both lower than Q1 2022 and is lower than the same quarter the year earlier, Q2 2021. Moreover, the joint municipal waste management strategy that was reviewed in January showed that Hampshire has the lowest recycling rate of any non-municipal disposal authority. So we're really bad at recycling. Whilst I appreciate that Winchester is highly dependent on Hampshire for refuse management, how can this metric be green when Hampshire keep on delaying when the new refuse facilities will be in place? The first one.
Do we have anybody who would like to address that one? Councillor Todd, perhaps with your dual hat on.
Maybe whilst Councillor Todd is just looking at that, Councillor Wallace, I think that there has been quite considerable debate about the recycling, and obviously we're the collection authority, reliant on the county as the processing authority. I think it's fair to say 20 odd years ago we were probably ahead of the game in Hampshire. Now we're behind the game in what we're able to process, and so there are certain elements that obviously in other authorities you'd be able to put in your recycling bin that we can't process at this time. Obviously efforts are being made to take out certain elements and put them into other recycling bins elsewhere in the district to try and help alleviate that, but that's a separate operation having to be dealt with separately. I think you'll be aware that the new processing plant in the Eastleigh district has been approved for Hampshire, and obviously as that comes online we will be able to do more than we're currently able. So we are a little bit in a cleft stick at this point on what we physically can process ourselves. Measures have been taken to try and alleviate on some of those items, but still it's not fully available, and we acknowledge therefore that we have some deficiency there when we've discussed that at some length with the officers in the.
Councillor Todd.
Yeah, a couple of other comments. Thank you for those comments, Councillor Horrell, was very helpful. I think there's a few things. Firstly, for good or ill, the way the target has been set is in comparison to the 2019-20 outturn, and you know that's how it's set. I think there's a case for saying that we need to find a way of perhaps being more sensitive and showing development over time. There are factors, that have an impact on recycling rate, which change from year to year. So the one that is mentioned in the comments here is the fact that if you have a very dry summer, your amount of green waste goes down, and so your recycling rate goes down versus what it would be otherwise. The other factor that we need to properly understand, and I think it might be useful to have a discussion about the more granular picture, is that there was a problem to the extent that it got recognised as a national public health problem, that there was a spectacular amount of glass being recycled during the pandemic, because people were drinking a lot at home in order to survive the experience of being locked in their home with their loved ones, or for whatever reason they might have been doing it. And it actually became an issue. In another life, I'm part of the Alcohol Health Alliance in my work life, and there was a real concern about the levels of alcohol being consumed during that pandemic. And actually there was a sharp increase in alcohol-related mortality during the pandemic, in addition to the people who were, obviously it was dwarfed by the level of COVID mortality, but there was also an alcohol-related mortality increase. And so there are these other factors that we need to properly understand. And one of the things that in particular is hard to understand is the pandemic. The fact that everybody was at home and consuming differently did have an impact on recycling. And that, combined with what's talked about here in terms of the hot summer, reducing the garden waste volumes, also had an impact. So I think it's absolutely right that this gets scrutinised. The figure that is, I think, the metric that we're doing things well is the residual waste figure, because that's ultimately what we want, which is what's the amount of unrecycled waste that is going into the incinerators, at least in Hampshire, since that's what we do with our unrecycled waste. And ultimately, that's the figure that needs to be going down. We need as little as that figure to get smaller and smaller and smaller over time, and that's our big priority.
Thank you, Councillor.
I would stress that those comments about alcohol consumption did relate to national figures. I don't know what the picture was in the Winchester comment. I wouldn't dare to comment on what the alcohol consumption figures were within our district.
And particularly not with regard to our councillors. Thank you, Councillor Todd, and thank you, Councillor Horrell. Councillor Wallace, does that help? And perhaps that can be scrutinised in more detail depending on the Q3 numbers.
I understand the answer. However, there's something wrong if our KPIs are showing as green when we are within Hampshire, we are right at the bottom of the league. Within Winchester, our numbers are worse than they were last quarter and worse than they were this time last year. And we're still showing ourselves
Sorry,
green.
Councillor Todd.
Yeah, just very quickly, although Hampshire does have the lowest recycling rate of any county council, we are the number 2, at least on the latest full year validated figures that have been published. So we have the second highest level of recycling within the district and within the county, and hopefully we'll maintain that position when the new figures get published. The other thing to mention is the figures do vary quite a lot across the year, and it is worth looking over a slightly longer time period. But certainly I know that ourselves and the equivalent people with an interest in recycling levels in Hart, Eastleigh and Test Valley will be looking at where we will come in the league table with great interest when the government publishes the figures.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. And I think it's a really important message that you point out that it's the reduction in the non-recycled waste that's actually the most important figure here. Councillor Wallace, what was your next question?
Thank you. So the next one was on the TCE08, which is one of the annual KPIs. It's the district carbon emissions. I was surprised that the 2020-21 data is not in the report. My understanding is that the data was released several months ago, back in around about June, July time, I believe. So I was surprised it wasn't in this report.
Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I think the lag is a little longer than that, Councillor Wallace. I can see here it says in the report expected autumn 22. So I think it's just a little bit later. And then, of course, there's a validation process. But I'm very happy to take that back to the team to check where that one is.
Yeah, I recall because when I looked at the Q1 performance monitoring, I know it had just come out at that point. So it came out 3 months ago. So
Mrs. Taylor will pick that up, Councillor Wallace. What's your next question?
Right. On the Tier 1 projects, carbon neutral programme, commercial energy. Last month, Warrington became the first UK local authority to produce all its own electricity, following the completion of the new Cirencester hybrid solar farm. What proportion of Winchester Council's electricity is self-generated, and what other opportunities are available to increase this? That might be one we want to take offline, but...
If I may, Chair. Yes, indeed, Councillor Wallace. We are just scrapping through the paper here quite quickly to catch up with your quick-fire delivery of the question. So I can see it's a question in the carbon plan. Again, if we can come back to you on that one. I sense it might be... I see the leader indicating, very happy for you to come in and speak with the officer team if there are specific inquiries about any of these matters, because it's a longer question, it's a longer answer than we can give you in a couple of minutes tonight, and we'd like to do justice to that.
One moment, Councillor Todd. I'm just going to Councillor Horrell as chair of the panel.
Councillor Wallace, this particular programme actually had a lot of discussion, and of course the important document that we're due to see is the roadmap. And the data that goes with that in terms of supporting the actions. And we know that that is due imminently. We had a discussion with the officer at the time, in fact, about how important that is to give us the detail of all of the elements that come together, and as I say, some of the data that is then supporting that. So hopefully when that is published, we'll have a jolly good review of that specifically, and if there's anything missing, we can ensure that's covered. But we did defer a little of this discussion because of the roadmap being such a significant document that was needed to, in fairness to everyone, give the full picture. Thank you.
Councillor Todd?
The thing I would point out is this particular KPI review, coming back to the point that was made about the journey that it goes on before it reaches the final point. That's the final step in the process is when it goes to Cabinet in December. So what could be helpful and would mean that we're not sort of scrabbling around now, because I don't think we were quite expecting this. You know, we can provide more considered answers, and where we're saying we have to take things away and come back later, it may be appropriate, I think might be helpful if we can get the questions, dare I say it, with some notice ahead of the Cabinet, the December Cabinet, and we'll be very happy to answer them in public there, also having had a time to pull them together and have a proper considered response to the points that have been raised. I think there's a useful discussion also to see whether there's a way, which is a matter for this committee and not for the Cabinet, if there's a way of, as you've started to talk about, involving having wider perhaps involvement in how performance panel works, and having members having the option to raise questions there or possibly attend as observers. But that's a matter for this committee, since I think it is defined as a subcommittee of this committee and you have to be a member of it to be there.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Does that answer that one, Councillor Wallace, and they will follow up with you? Can I ask you to just be a little slower on this one so the officers have time to find the place in the paper before you launch into the question?
Sure.
Many thanks.
Last one, and again, this might be one you want to take away. It's on the Winchester movement strategy. So in the same kind of area. I was trying to do them in order. On bus provision, I was going to say, how are Winchester and Hampshire using the government's commitment to cap bus fares at £2 per journey from January to March next year? How are the councils using this to encourage increased bus usage in the Winchester district?
I believe that one's for you, Councillor Todd.
I can have a go at it. This is one where if I wanted to, I could play this is looking back at Q2, and that's the scope of this particular paper. I think it's a good question. It is primarily a matter for the County Council as the public transport authority. I'm in the fortunate position of being on the it's called the Transport and Environment Committee now, and I'm very happy to follow up on that. I think we will look for Hampshire to take a lead on this, but we are always open and interested to collaborate with them on how we can support any initiatives they might want to be taking.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Was there anything else you'd like to add on this?
I think I've taken enough time, but thank you very much.
Thank you. So feel free to take it up with the officers offline.
Yep.
And feed into a suggested cabinet piece, but also please do get the questions in advance of the performance panel, and then they will raise them for you. Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just request that when Councillor Todd comes back with an answer to the question that's just been raised about this £2 fare, is that answer going to be given to all members, or is it just for this committee? I'd like to know a little bit more about that as well, if I may. Thank you.
It will come back to the panel at some point because it needs to be discussed further. But Councillor Todd, do you have a response on that?
I mean, you can obviously ask your local county councillor, because he will definitely know, since he is leader of the county council. But yeah, if I receive a useful answer that I can forward, I'll be happy to forward it. I think we all have great interest in that, and it could be one where, frankly, ideas from district councillors as to how we can make the most of it could be something we could feed back to the county council and help them make a bigger impact behind this initiative.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Do we have any other questions or comments on the performance panel paper in front of us? No? Okay, then I'd like to thank the panel as always for the time they've taken over this, and for looking so thoroughly at our papers behind the scenes. Okay, coming on to item 9, noting the work programme going forwards. Any questions or comments on the work programme? Nope, okay, that's noted. And then our final item on the agenda to note the forward plan that's within our agenda pack this evening. No? Okay, then indulge me for a moment before I close this meeting. It is indeed Richard Botham's final meeting of scrutiny. And after many years supporting this panel with various different hats on, I'd just like to say thank you for all of your support, all of your help that you've given to us, your quick answers, for coming back to us when you said you would, and for being downright brilliant. So thank you on behalf of all of the Scrutiny Committee tonight, and you will be sorely missed. And on that sad note, I shall close the meeting, but we wish Richard Botham well. Thank you.